Bringing that to a close, a lot more of that Wednesday night and Thursday. What I'd like to segue over to now is some of the things I talked about last night. It was really, if you were there, I think many of you were, was a really deep conversation with a beautiful response from the community, and I want to bring you into that. It was propelled in large by a conversation I had with a young man. I'll give you a little bit of biography here. A couple of years ago when I was here, I was walking through the open market. A young man comes up to me and says, "Are you Rabbi Finley?" And Mirav and I have a joke that sometimes I'll be in a movie theater, or Mirav and I would go out dancing, and someone on the dance floor would say, "Are you Rabbi Finley?" So we used to call these Rabbi Finley moments. So I'm out down in the shuk buying some dates or something. And the person's young man says, "Are you Rabbi Finley?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Do you remember me? I'm Avigal's age. I was in Hebrew school with Abigail." And I said, "Did I do your bar mitzvah?" He said, "No, we were only there for 1 year. I was 10 years old." I said, "Sorry, man. It's just not ringing a bell." He shared with me his name. I said, "Vaguely familiar." And he said, "Well, I made Aliyah many years ago. I served in the army." And he said, and it turned out to be kind of a mess. And I want to repair it. And I just saw you, and I think you're the person who can help me." I said, "Great." So Meirav and I had a long 2 hour conversation with him. He was in the army and actually in a recon unit, very, very elite unit. And his army service just kind of fizzled, and he couldn't quite understand why. And he came back to make it better. He came back to repair it. So we had a long conversation with him. I think we gave him good, solid guidance, just as as older people having a perspective on life. So he was going to go home, come back. So he went home, came back in 2023 to begin a master's degree at Tel Aviv University. And of course, the war broke out, and he got called into the reserves. I saw him briefly when we were here in December, January. He had been in Gaza the whole time, had a couple of days off, and came down and we spoke. And he said he really wants to help create spiritual community for English speakers in Tel Aviv. We promised to stay in touch. Of course, we left and ended up coming back now. So we've stayed in email contact. Well, when we met, now I'll get down to it. When we met, he said, "I've been in Gaza the entire time." He said, "When I got there, they were creating, out of the reservists, they were creating special roles, and he was called the chod, or the spearhead of people who enter and clear buildings before the entire platoon comes in. These spearheads consisted of 4 people, a machine gunner, a sharpshooter, a radio man, and a commander. And he was the machine gunner. And he spent his whole time in Gaza being on the spear of clearing out buildings where Hamas was entrenched or in position, shooting at Israeli soldiers, and they had to be cleared out one at a time. When his unit was pulled out of Gaza, he volunteered to stay, and they said, "You can't stay. Your entire brigade is being pulled out." He said, "I want to stay." Here's what he shared with me. He says, "We got good at it, and to hand this off to brand new people, they're going to get killed." So he moved to an entirely different unit so that he could stay in Gaza. He's been in combat consistently since October, I think the end of October, when his unit was finally mobilized. And I was in awe. It's very few, and never in the history of Israel have people been in combat continuously for 10 months. Even in the American military tradition, I mean, there were divisions put on the line and then pulled off the line after 2 or 3 months. Well, he went from one brigade to another to stay on the line, because he didn't want people who came into his position who did not understand how to clear a building to get killed learning how to do it, because a lot of guys got killed exactly in this way. He shared with me a crisis. I wanted to share that with you. He's staying with a friend in Tel Aviv, and he shared with me how painful it is to come to Tel Aviv, because Tel Aviv is a rather, I'll say, left-leaning city, and I want to clarify that immediately. I consider myself a centrist, which means I take wisdom from the left, the center, and the right. When I say the political left, I mean the union left, a better deal for the working person, a greater societal net. So I am pro the values of the left. The part of me that's more conservative is go slow, and considering the economic dimension, I'm a bit of a libertarian in me, that as much as possible, the government should stay out of our lives. But my values are definitely what I would call center left. I don't mean that. There's a hard left that, as we know from the United States, has become kind of a religion. Okay, so this is not the what I call the political union left. It's the hard left that really, in my opinion, does not really care deeply about working people. It's mostly invested in hatred of the United States, of regulated free markets, of Western civilization, and in particular the state of Israel. We saw this with DEI and so forth. So here's his pain. He comes to Tel Aviv and he's being told, you're a pawn of Netanyahu extending the war just to stay in office. Because if he wanted to, he could end the war in a minute and get the hostages home. You're being manipulated, you're being used. And he doesn't think so. He thinks the best way to get the hostages home is defeat Hamas. He knows these people up close and personal. They're evil. He knows they're evil. They're not going to make a deal, in his opinion. They're not going to release hostages. They need to be defeated. And he said, I really respect you, and I don't know who to ask. Is it true? Is what they're saying true? Am I fighting? Are we fighting and dying just because Netanyahu wants to stay in office? I had to take a deep breath. And here's what I said. I don't have access to the inner life of any human being unless they share it with me. I don't know what people's motivations and goals are. I believe that people barely know their own motivations and goals. All I know is what people do. All I know is what people do, what people say and what people do. I don't claim to be a mind reader. So anybody who says that they can read the mind of Benjamin Netanyahu, that they know his inner life conversations, I would say they're being dishonest because nobody knows that. What does Netanyahu say? He says Hamas must be defeated in order for the hostages to be released. Hamas will not release the hostages, one thing. And Hezbollah has to be defeated because the north of Israel has been evacuated since October 8th. There's 100,000 internal Israeli refugees that can't go home because of this incessant war of attrition on the northern border. I'll have a lot more to say about it in just a moment. I said, I believe that the Israeli government, the Israeli military that woke up from a disaster on October 7th and October 8th, they're invested in defeating Hamas, creating safety for the state of Israel, including all of its inhabitants. And you are there doing a great monumental thing, defeating an outright terrorist organization, and the best way to defeat the hostages. So I said, I'm not pro Netanyahu. I'm not on the Likud. I'm not right wing. I just believe that because of his actions, he wants to defeat Hamas. I said, do you have any questions for me? I want to share with you how relieved he was, how relieved he was that a person who he respected told him, your friends who have died were not killed because they were being manipulated. They died in the service of a great cause, defending Israel, releasing the hostages. And I said, I believe this is a war, truly a war, the front lines of a war for the future of Western civilization. This axis of evil, again, I'm giving you my my theory of history. Russia, China, Iran, they are against the values of Western civilization, and they have a long game. And that is a war of attrition against Western values. Now, the problem of Western values is, with Western values, we are typically not militaristic. Look how much we were not ready for Pearl Harbor or the Chinese invasion of Korea. The mistakes we made in going into Vietnam. I mean, I think the values were right. Execution was terrible. Probably should never ever gone into that war. But the only country in the world that can protect Western civilization is the United States. The front line of the war for Western civilization is here in Israel today. So I said, I don't know how this war is going to go down in history, but I believe when people wake up, they will understand that the Hamas butchering of Israelis was part of their vision, as they have said, to this 1,000 times. that the Saturday people are first and the Sunday people are next. Look how the Christian Yazidis were treated by ISIS in Iraq and Christian minorities in Syria. I said, you are not just defending the state of Israel. You're not just saving the life of a soldier who would replace you without your skills, and you volunteered to stay these entire 10 months. There's something epic happening, and you're part of it. And you know, he was so grateful to me that and I think I speak for all of you, that I gave meaning to his suffering, meaning to his life, from the depth of my heart to the depth of his heart. And what I realized was, as I shared in my brief message, and I'm sorry to you, um, people's souls are at stake. This young man who was willing to suffer, he was willing to be in combat. His soul was hurt because people were saying to him that your sacrifice is meaningless, that you're a pawn in a manipulation. And I'm sorry to say that Tel Aviv, which is, you know, it's left leaning in general, but there's a lot of hard left here. I saw somebody wrote a graffiti about this, says something like Yashar Koach to the Chayalim who are destroying the Mechablim, you know, strength to the soldiers who are killing the terrorists. And somebody drew a line through soldiers, right? You know, I hope I'm not a graffiti person. I hope someone gets rid of that. So there's something of a disrespect. It's hard for me to say this, but it's true. There's something of a disrespect for the Israeli military resolve to defeat Hamas. We've heard this from more than this young man. I'll mention his name once he gives me permission. I didn't know I was going to be so moved by my having coffee with him on Friday, but other people as well. They don't want to wear their uniforms in Tel Aviv. They don't want to discuss the war in Tel Aviv because people just start shouting them down. Mirav and I had this. We went to a celebration yesterday, and you know, someone brought it up to me, Rob, and she said, "I'm sorry, I don't sit around people who hate. You need to stop talking that way." And they said, "What do you mean? You know, he doesn't care about the hostage." She says, "You don't know what he cares about. You think you know what he cares about, but you know, Netanyahu says the best way to get the hostages home is defeat Hamas." And they went into the whole diatribe. And Mirav actually had to say, "I'm not going to be in a conversation filled with hatred. I'm going to have to excuse myself." So we went to a celebration of a wedding, and it's as if you can't get away from it. People want to know what your politics are. And if you don't want to talk, they say, "Okay, so you're one of them." So I hid out in a corner. I just kind of projected, "Don't talk to me about politics. I'm not doing this. I came to a wedding." So it is like that here. Now, here's what happened last night with the community: an outpouring of desire to help, an outpouring of how do we show these soldiers that we support them? How do they know that their struggle is valued? How do we communicate to them how much we honor the deaths and maiming of their comrades in arms? How do we let them know that we support them and we love that we pray for them? And I said, we tell everybody we know that we have a support of a community behind us. And Mirav and I talked about, we're gonna find a formal way to give you the best resources. You know, I follow, for example, on Instagram, IDF, Friends of IDF, and so forth. Just look for any IDF, Instagram, Facebook, follow it, you know, comment to your heart's content, because the soldiers read it as well. When they're not fighting, they are on their social media with clear guidelines not to, you know, to hide your name and not give out your position. So we're going to figure out for things you can do. People then ask, as a few people in this room have said, how can we go back to what we did in October and give money to soldiers? And we're going to reinvent that. We thought about having an Oratora platoon, you know, the 40 soldiers adopted by Oratora. We're going to make sure they have the right Kevlar, the right helmets, because Kevlar, you know, the protection plates in the flak jacket, it gets shot up, helmets get shot up, and they have to come back to town and scrounge when the supply line gets interrupted. And Mirav and I have promised a few people we will keep them supplied, and many people said we want to be part of that. So we're going to inform all of you of that. The second thing I want to say is there's a lot of trepidation here. We had to two alarms go off today. I was sitting in this room where I broadcast, and I hear the sirens from outside the door, and one can hear the explosions. And twice today we went to our mamad, our merchav memugan, our protected area, and they're bombing the north relentlessly. They've shot missiles at Tel Aviv. They've been intercepted. Um, we're not scared. We're not scared. We're furious. We're furious that when Israel fights back, the world condemns. When Israel kills this evil thug Nasrallah who murdered 283 of, if I'm not mistaken, American military people, mostly Marines, in 1983. I remember the day particularly. He's a murderer. He's a thug. He advocates genocide. So what I read in the New York Times, Israel escalated the conflict to stop this war of attrition so 100,000 people can go home and get rid of a man who spends all his time every day plotting murder of innocent people. Right? People say Israel escalated because they finally took this man out when rockets are raining on the north of Israel every single day since October 8th. The world doesn't care. Israel fights back, it's suddenly a world emergency. Israelis are furious about this. I mean, the politics are put aside. Israelis are furious, profoundly appreciative of the United States, but also when they hear things like, must be a ceasefire, must be a ceasefire, what this means for Israelis, especially Israeli soldiers, is surrender. Ceasefire before Hamas is defeated means surrender, means Hamas comes back into power. They crawl out of their caves, jubilant, with flags, and say, we've defeated Israel. That's what's going to happen if there is a ceasefire. So it's much more than a ceasefire. When the fighting stops, and it will eventually, there has to be a pacification of Gaza, however that looks. So one of the frustrations, with this administration, and again, I'm profoundly grateful and admire this administration because there's a lot they have to balance. Number one, the opposition to Israel and the war, and the desire to support Israel. So politicians can't say exactly what they think, and I do believe that exactly what President Biden thinks is a demilitarization of Gaza, stop the war, and get the hostages home. I think he has, in general, the same goals as Israel. The problem is he can't say it every time he says the word ceasefire. Israelis would love to hear that more. Israelis would love to say, defeat Hamas, pacification of Gaza, which means demilitarized, create a flourishing economy there that is not a constant threat for Israel and not the front line of Iran's desire to destroy human civilization, destroy the Middle East, and have the Middle East devolve into another 100 years of war. I always remind people, the Abraham Accords, right? Most of the countries in the Middle East do not want Iran in charge. Most countries in the Middle East want normalized relations with Israel. That's the consensus in the Middle East, except for Iran. So that's what's at stake here. And I say it every chance I get. And Israelis are resolute. There's relief. I believe that Israel is not going to accept an interminable war of attrition. For Israel, it's not an escalation. It's ending of a war of attrition, ending internal refugees, getting people home, and letting people know if you bomb the state of Israel, if you try to murder Israeli civilians, you will pay a price. And Nasrallah finally paid the price, a price he deserved a long time ago, but it finally happened. Now, it's scary because Israel is taking action to protect its civilians. There's no other reason Israel's doing this. There's no military gain in fighting Hamas. It's just to make Hamas and Hezbollah, just make them stop killing civilians. But of course, the world press treats it as somehow Israel has, instead of accepting a war of attrition, has decided to stop a war of attrition. So the mood here, I'm going to say it, when I hear the sirens go off, I say, okay, time to go to the reinforced room. I hope a bomb doesn't land on us, truly. I'm not scared. I'm furious that the world is not taking this seriously and not taking the protection of the state of Israel seriously. I am, and again, I don't want to rile anybody out. I am grateful for the political and military leadership of this government, including the head of government. We are profoundly grateful in the way that the IDF has rebounded with incredible intelligence and military skill. You know, what's happening in the newspapers here, you're hearing the story of the pilot who let loose the bomb that destroyed the reinforced bunker of Nasrallah. They were able to interview him, of course, not his name. He described his morning, he described the mission, he described coming home and going back to work today. So the newspapers are filled with the as it were behind the scenes story. They're very profound. They're riveting, and I'll maybe share more of those stories on Rosh Hashanah. And I'd like to wrap this section up by saying I want to go back to my conversation with this young man, and his focus was, does my life have meaning? Is the suffering worthwhile? And I took his question and I thought about Rosh Hashanah in general, as I shared last night. Um, it's riveting, it's compelling when you're here. I read, my favorite newsletters and blogs and people. I always want to expand my mind, but I think I'm pretty convinced this is a war worth winning. Terribly sad there are so many fine young people sacrificing their lives. And I believe the sacrifice of lives and limbs is not in vain. I'm convinced of that. I don't think I can be talked out of that. But it's great to be inspired. And then we have high holidays coming up. And I look into my heart and I say, I have to remind myself. First, I think about you. I think people within and in spite of all this want spiritual guidance and part of my job. So I get back to my Bible. I get back to the Machzor, and I shared this in my Shabbat thought and last night. Um, as I open my Bible up, then I make sure to read through as much of Psalms and Proverbs as I can every day. Uh, it just drives into my heart. As I said, I feel that as much as I'm reading the text is reading me. Um, these long dead spiritual geniuses from the Bible, the Talmud, the Kabbalah, Hasidism, they deposited words into the tradition that speak eternally. And we've preserved this tradition of great wisdom and depth and understanding of the human condition, preserved it generation after generation for us, for us. And I read it, and as I'm preparing for you, I realize they're talking to me. They're not saying we're going to help a rabbi prepare for Rosh Hashanah. They're talking to me. And it's always stunning for me when I review everything because there's a holiday on the horizon and I got to prepare for the holiday. And I realize, oh, that's what the holiday's for. When you prepare for the holiday, your heart is pierced and enriched and expanded, and the meaning of your life becomes clear. And we find direction, we find purpose. All of that happens to me when I start to prepare, and that's the main thing I want to share with you, because we are all in a struggle, not the struggle of this young man who was in house to house combat for 10 months. And I can't begin to tell you how much I wanted to honor him and the words of honor that I said to him and how much he appreciated it. But we are in a fight. I've met so many people over my years whose lives are frittered away, not valuing their relationships, not understanding where they were in life, not understanding what life required of them, not sure how to create a flourishing life. We get distracted, we take wrong turns, and then they wake up one day and they said, I don't want to be a distracted sleepwalker anymore, not living out my values. What do I do? Well, this is the answer. So there is a fight. There's a fight for our souls. There's a fight for meaning. There's a political and military fight on now, but let's not forget the internal fight to bring lives of meaning and goodness and honor and dignity to all of our lives.